All right, let's see. Okay, I want to test something. Can somebody give me a thumbs up if you can see the document? You can see it? Okay. All right. You're not supposed to see it, so close your eyes. Okay. All right. Bismillah. Let's go on the slideshow. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.
Walaikum assalam.
All right, guys, welcome back. Lesson 8. Hope you guys are excited. Hope you guys are ready to take some notes. First thing we'll do today, go in your groups. You have some partners next to you. Take out your notes from last time and go through those notes and find one point that you want to mention in the recap today. All right? So let's start with that. Go ahead quickly. And I'll bring you back in like a minute or so.
It was getting to it's like I wanted to because like it affected me and like resetting it. So
All right, this is enough. Come back, come back. Okay. Is Sakina there?
Sakina is not here for us today.
Okay. Abuji, could you select some people?
Okay, I can start selecting some people. Rabia. I selected you, the first person. Let's go for us.
Sorry, say again.
Rabia.
So just briefly mention what you talked about in your group. Perhaps one point that you want to, I guess, share with everybody that you remember.
We're still opening up our documents.
Okay, so Rabia was still opening up our documents. Let's go.
Okay.
Faizan Ahmed.
They bought Zayd from a slave shop.
They bought Zaid from a slave shop.
Do you remember who brought Zayd?
Prophet Muhammad. Oh no, Khadija.
No, so it was Khadija's uncle, and they gave Zayd to the Prophet ﷺ when they got married. And so Zayd technically became like the Prophet ﷺ's adopted son, and there was so much love and good relationship between them. Good point. All right. One more person.
One more person. Let's see. Dania.
First person who struck the Kaaba was named Walid ibn Mughira.
Is it loaded?
The first person who struck the Kaaba was named Walid ibn Mughira.
You get that first?
Yeah,
The
I got
first-
it. Walid ibn Mughira, right? Okay, good. So we'll briefly mention that person again. I don't know if you guys ever heard of there's a companion. His name was Khalid ibn Walid. If you might have heard of him. His name is a bit popular. He was one of the best commanders, so army commander of the Muslims. He was undefeated. So he's the son of Walid ibn Mughira. Well, we'll briefly talk about that again. So let's move on. Let's first. So this is the outline. What we'll talk about this lesson is we're just going to briefly recap what we've talked about so far. We'll talk about prophethood, and we'll also talk about some virtuous character and lessons we can learn from the Prophet ﷺ. Mainly his love for all the people that were following him, his patience through trial and perseverance. So I want to touch on something a little bit different than we've usually talked about. So first, quick recap. So what we talked about last time, we mentioned some of the important people from the family of the Prophet ﷺ. We should know that he had many daughters, and that both of his sons passed away early. And then we should also know some important names like Khadija, who was the first wife of the Prophet ﷺ, and she was technically the first believer in the message of Islam as well, which is very important. She was one of the strongest supporters of the Prophet ﷺ. And that just shows, how much love we can have for her too, because of how much the Prophet ﷺ loved her. And also the daughter of the Prophet ﷺ, Fatima, who later marries Ali, who is the cousin of the Prophet ﷺ. There are two very important people that we can keep in mind. Something about Fatima, she was known as Fatima az-Zahra, which means the radiant, the majestic one. And she's called this because she was very pious, she had a very strong character, and she was known for her beauty. So that's the daughter of the Prophet ﷺ, another very important person. And later on in this lesson, if we're able to get to it, we'll talk about his story when Fatima radiallahu anha was a small child, and some of the elders of the Quraysh, they dumped some waste on the Prophet ﷺ, and she stood up for her dad in front of those powerful elders who did that. So we also talked about Zayd, like Faizan mentioned, the story of Zayd ibn Haritha, and how a lot of narrations state how loved he was by the Prophet ﷺ, and how the important thing to remember from his story is the loyalty he had for the Prophet ﷺ. Because if you remember, his father came to get him after traveling so long from Syria to Mecca, and his father loved him so much, he made a whole poem about him. And still Zayd said that I can't choose anyone over the over the Prophet ﷺ. At that time he wasn't the messenger, but he saw his beautiful character, his amazing attractive appearance. He couldn't pick anybody over this Prophet ﷺ. So that was his loyalty. That's one of the main lessons we learned from his story. And then we talked about Surah Al-Kawthar. A possible reason of revelation for that was when the Prophet ﷺ was mocked by somebody. And we talked about this hawd, this pool that's in the hereafter, which will be given to the Prophet ﷺ, and all the believers will be drinking from it. And lastly, we talked about the rebuilding of the Kaaba. So that was last lesson. And briefly again, this is the family tree that we portrayed last time. You can see Khadija is up there at the top left, and you can also see Fatima, two important names we should remember. And so we'll get to this soon. But the thing about the Kaaba, which I wanted to kind of go back on and stress, it's one of the most holy places, one of the first structures built ever. And even Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran, he talks about this Kaaba, and he says, Inna awwala bayt, so the first house of worship, wudi'a lin-nas, that was made for humanity, like everyone. It's in Mecca, bi Mecca Mubaraka. It's in the blessed place of Mecca. And it's huda, it's a huda for all the people, alameen. So this place, Mecca, it's a really blessed and holy place. It's one of the first houses of worship ever made, and it's a guide for everyone. That's what Allah says in the Quran. So let's go back to that story we talked about, the rebuilding of the Kaaba. And if you remember, the disbelievers, the elders of the Quraysh, they're a little bit afraid to lay a hand on the Kaaba. They didn't want to touch it because if you just remember, maybe 30 years ago, there was that guy who brought a bunch of elephants and he tried to demolish the Kaaba, right? And so do you remember what happened to him? Allah basically stopped him and he took out his entire army, like an airstrike, basically. So the elders knew that there was some sort of, seriousness about this issue with the Kaaba. But they also knew that the Kaaba was weakening. Its bricks were slowly being, it was decreasing its strength, and they had to rebuild it in order for it to stay strong. But the last thing that they wanted was the same thing that happened to Abraha, was the punishment of Allah. So one thing that we can learn from this is both Abraha and the Quraysh, they wanted to go and break the Kaaba, but their intention was different. The reason Abraha wanted to do it was to destroy it. He didn't want it to stay. He didn't want the Kaaba to stay. And the reason why the Quraysh wanted to destroy it was to rebuild it stronger. One intention was evil, and one intention was pure. So the lesson is that intentions matter. The very first hadith that I learned this semester. It's a very popular one. You guys may have heard as well. إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ. So all actions are actually by the intention, which means that the intention determines the action. The intention is very important. So you think about this, why do you talk to someone that you're talking to? Why do you study the things you're studying? Why do you even come to YCC? These are really important things to think about because it determines our action. So we can have a good intention or we can have a not so good intention. And you want to try to be, in every action that we have, we want to try to have a good intention, just like we see here in the story. So, like we mentioned, and like one of the sisters mentioned, Walid ibn Mughira, he's the first one to put an axe to the Kaaba and to break it. And like I mentioned, he's the father of Khalid ibn Walid, who was one of the greatest, if not the greatest, Muslim army commander after he became Muslim. So just an extra thing to know. And the reason why I put this image here, I just wanted to show you guys some interesting parts about the Kaaba, because we talked about the black stone, but if you guys haven't seen the Kaaba in real life, you don't exactly know where that black stone is, and you can't kind of connect the picture. So look at this diagram here, and you can see some important parts about the Kaaba. That black stone is there, according to the diagram, it's number 1. And it's by the door of the Kaaba. And some of these places are very special. If you guys ever visit Mecca and you're able to see the Kaaba and make tawaf around it, there's a lot of places around the Kaaba where du'as are accepted. And this is what the Prophet ﷺ told us. The first of them is the black stone. So if you make a dua around the black stone, then it's accepted. It's very likely that it's accepted. And there's some other important parts about the Kaaba, like there's this place called the Multazam, which is number 6. It's very close to the black stone as well. It's also another place where du'as are accepted. And then just a fun fact about this is that when they rebuilt this Kaaba, originally the door was on ground level, so people could walk into the Kaaba. But when they rebuilt it, they raised it up off the ground so that people could not access the Kaaba and steal things from inside the Kaaba, because they had a lot of valuables in there. They would place all their valuables inside the inside the Kaaba. And before Islam, there were actually also idols inside the Kaaba as well. So just a fun fact. That's why you'll see the Kaaba is a bit raised. The door looks like it's higher, and it doesn't seem like people can enter. But so, and then going back to the story, the very last part about the rebuilding of the Kaaba was putting the stone on. And this is where the Prophet ﷺ came in. Because the tribe leaders who were building the Kaaba, they got into a bit of an argument because the stone is very important. And it's the last brick, it's the final brick. So they kind of got into a heated argument. And at one point they just agreed that we'll let the person who walks into the door next put the stone on. And it just so happened to be the Prophet ﷺ. So what he did, instead of putting the stone on by himself, and this is a very interesting thing about his character. It's a beautiful way. He tried to include everyone. So he said that all of you guys stand up and bring a cloth. So they all held the cloth with their hands, and they put the black stone inside in the middle of the cloth. And that way, everybody had a part in this. So it wasn't just one person putting the stone on. The Prophet ﷺ made people feel special and included. And this is an example of how he did that. So once they held onto the cloth, they brought it to the Kaaba, and then he put the stone on. So that's an interesting, I guess, story you might want to remember, and just think about. It's actually a skill to make people feel special and included. That's what the Prophet ﷺ did here. And inshallah, we can try and, in our friend circles, whenever we're talking with people, we can make sure that we apply this prophetic principle and try to make our friends feel included as well. So now let's get on to what we want to talk about today. So we've basically gone through the first 40 years of the Prophet ﷺ's life. And now we're approaching the essence of Sirah, which is the prophethood. When the Prophet ﷺ really gets the revelations and the greater trials start to come, and all the different stories you hear about in the Sirah. But just think about it. If we jump straight to Revelation, we would have missed all this early life and development and all the things that we learn about the Prophet ﷺ that allow us to appreciate him much more. And think about all the things we've learned so far. At the beginning, we started with Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam and his dua for Mecca. That's where it all started. And we talked about the miracle of Zamzam and how it brought people there, because in the desert, people were looking for water sources. So they saw Zamzam and there was a lot of water there. And so people started to migrate there and settle. And that's how Mecca came from a barren land to a land that is so populated and wonderful today. And then we talked about tribal society and how different it is from today's modern society. And then we started with the birth of the Prophet ﷺ and the miracles, the year of the elephant, where the elephants tried to come and destroy the Kaaba. And people literally saw those birds coming and pelting those stones. That was like a miracle of God. So these amazing events are happening as the Prophet ﷺ is coming into the world. And we talked about his early life, growing up in the desert, away from the city. We talked about the splitting of the chest, which, I mean, it can tell you how much of a special person he is already. And then finally, we got to the teenage years, his working as a merchant, his marriage, and now finally the rebuilding of the Kaaba. And now we're here at this section where he starts to get revelation finally. So without knowing all of this, we wouldn't really have been able to appreciate the holistic life of the Prophet ﷺ. Because when we go through Sirah, we need to understand him as a human. We need to know his upbringing, his work, his marriage, his children, the gains that he had, the losses that he felt, and what people really thought about him in society. Because think about it, we'll go into this either today or next lesson. Just a few minutes ago, he's known as the most trustworthy and the most loved person in the entire community. And a few minutes later, when he declares that he has a revelation from God, he's called a liar. He's called a madman. And people are tortured because of him. So just think about the psychological effect that this has on the Prophet ﷺ and all the things we've learned about his life so far. It gives us a greater perspective of the Sirah. So you can't really understand someone else's story unless you walk in their shoes, unless you celebrate their victories, truly feel their losses, and empathize with them as a soul and not as a phenomenon, unless you truly understand their story as a person and not as a word on the screen. So that's what we're trying to do here. The more we learn about this development, the more we can understand how impactful these events are in the Sirah and how hurtful these trials are and how great these victories are when he finally feels them, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So even in this, there's a lesson for us. Even in that, the idea of people rejecting the Prophet ﷺ, even though he was known as the most trustworthy, that's something that we can learn from as well. Because one thing is that if and when we become more practicing, oftentimes we'll feel a lot of discouragement from people that are close to us. And we've got to realize that this is exactly what the Prophet ﷺ went through. He did the right thing and people discouraged him. So that's one thing that we can keep in mind. And the other thing is that we should try not to judge other people. So like those that judge the Prophet ﷺ, we should not be like those, and we should try and keep what's called a husn al-dhan. It's called I guess a good intention or a good thought about somebody else. Even if you see somebody, for example, hanging out with the wrong crowd, or they're doing something that you think is wrong, keep a good intention of them, give them an excuse, and don't necessarily judge them because you don't really truly know what's in their heart. So that's, I guess, 2 lessons we can learn from this. So, and let's look at this map here. So what we'll start to talk about as we get into the years of the prophethood are the first 6 years is what we're going to go through right now. And even these years, the Prophet ﷺ was not able to declare the message so openly. The first 3 years were private. And then when he finally declared it publicly, there was a lot of persecution and a lot of boycotting. So the first 3 years of the Sirah, of the prophethood, were private. The next 3 years, there was a lot of torture, a lot of persecution. And the next 3 years, so a total of 9 years, the next 3 years, there was a boycott, a very severe boycott. So that's the first years of the prophethood. And just think about this. In COVID, we were spending at least 1 or 2 years kind of isolated. And a lot of people were kind of panicking, like we're not making a lot of success, we're not making a lot of growth. But in about 6 or 7 years of Islam, only 70 people became Muslim. And there was a lot of difficulty. So most of those 70 people were the Prophet ﷺ's family and close friends. And after 5 years, 80% of those believers actually migrated to Abyssinia because there just wasn't a place to practice and worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Mecca. So they needed to find a place to practice Islam. So who's left in Mecca? After those 70 people become Muslim, majority of them travel to be able to practice Islam. And who's left with the Prophet ﷺ after 5 years of hardship? It's only a few followers. So the lesson we learn from this, again, is that the Prophet ﷺ is going at it. He's going at it. He's not quitting. He's staying patient, going at it trial after trial, difficult day after difficult day, to try and deliver the message of Islam one way or another. And this tells us about the magnificent character of the Prophet ﷺ. So 3 things that we can learn here. We've talked about his kindness and his softness. Remember the story about how he took that mentally ill woman across Medina and he kind of tended to all of her needs. So we know about the softness of his heart. We know about how much he cared and loved for his ummah. And there's hadith about how he said, I wish I could meet my brothers. And the companion said to him, are we not your brothers? We're living with you, right? And the Prophet ﷺ said that you're my companions, but the brothers, my brothers, are those who have faith in me and they've never seen me. So that's, inshallah, us here. And another thing is just learning about how much he loved all of us and how close he was with us. One time, the wife of the Prophet ﷺ, Aisha, she's one of the foremost narrators of the saying of the Prophet ﷺ, and she's one of the top scholars in Islam. She asked the Prophet ﷺ to make dua for her one day, and she said this as he was very happy. So the dua he made was for Allah to forgive her past sins and future sins, and to forgive her inward and outward sins. So when he said this dua, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, she felt so happy, and she felt so happy about how much care he put in this dua and how eloquently he said it. And the Prophet ﷺ told her, listen, I make this dua for my ummah every single salah. So 5 times a day, I'm making this dua for you and I. 5 times a day, every single day, he makes this dua for his ummah, for us. So that is how close he was to us. And though we've never seen him, we still believe in him, even though we're living 1,500 years away from him. That's, it's profound to think about. How can somebody be so close to us? He's making dua for us every day. That's it's very profound. But what about the patience and perseverance, the discipline of the Prophet ﷺ? We haven't talked about this that much. And there's a lot of inspirational speeches and motivational speeches out there. But the first and most disciplined one was the Prophet ﷺ. He had the most difficult task. And so just think about it, right? Who would endure going from the most loved person in society to the most hated in a matter of days? And how can you endure seeing your supporters who love you so much being tortured with boulders, with spears, with lashes? And the Prophet ﷺ knew he got revelation from God, but he was still called a liar. So how can you have so much patience and perseverance when you're experiencing this type of difficulty? That was the Prophet ﷺ's character. He had perfect forbearance in the face of his enemies, and he had the perfection of all good character traits. So 2 stories to kind of make this, tie this example together, is one story about the camel intestines, which we talked about just briefly. One time the Prophet ﷺ was praying in Mecca, and he was praying outside in front of the Kaaba, and some disbelievers, some of the elders of the Quraysh, they kind of had enough. They were so annoyed at him. They just looked at him and said, which one of you is gonna go and harass this guy right now. Like I'm annoyed by this person. So they brought a bunch of camel waste, like organs of the camels, and somebody took it and they dumped it on his back as he was doing sajda, as he was praying. How terrible of an action is that, first of all, right? But he kind of stayed patient, and his daughter Fatima came to wipe this away from him and stand up for him. So just imagine, these people were literally your family members, your close friends, and they're doing this action to you. They're dumping waste on you. Thinking about it is difficult, but experiencing it is a whole other thing. And so he still stayed patient after this, and he kept delivering the message and preaching the message of Islam. And the second story is, in the later years of the Prophet's message, he went to the city called Ta'if. And this is one of the hardest, most difficult stories of the seerah. He tried to go to Ta'if, and he was basically looking for a city where the Muslims could practice their Islam without persecution. So Mecca, there was a lot of torture, and he tried to go and find a different city where they could migrate to, so that things would be easier. So he went to Ta'if, which is not too far away from Mecca, and he talked with the leaders of Ta'if. And basically all three of them rejected him, severely rejected him. And so just imagine, you're the Prophet ﷺ, you're walking more than 200 miles to get to a different city with the hope of finding a home, right? And you get rejected. So now what? You have to walk all the way back 200 miles just to go back to the city where you're being persecuted. And not only that, as he was exiting the city, all the people in Ta'if, women, children, men, everyone, they lined up on the streets and they threw rocks at him. Every single person in that city threw rocks at the Prophet ﷺ until his feet bled and until he had bruises all over his body, just for trying to deliver the message of Islam, just for doing something good. This was the amount of difficulty the Prophet ﷺ went through, and yet he stayed patient and perseverant until his message was delivered. And the last thing that I want to talk about is his discipline. So we just mentioned that patience and that perseverance required, and the cultivation of that is a discipline. So oftentimes he would spend much of the second half of the night standing in prayer until his feet would swell. So, and he would do this very constantly. So he would basically do this every night. He would give up a portion of his sleep to worship Allah and to ask for success. And he would do this so often until his feet would literally swell from how much pain, physical pain he's going through. And so that's how disciplined he was. And so if we think about our own lives, each and every one of us goes through pain. Each and every one of us has difficulty, has trial, whether it's in school, whether it's at home, it's something. The Prophet ﷺ went through immense trial. And the result of this trial was his patience, his perseverance, his discipline in trying to succeed. So if anything, when we go through trial, we can follow the Prophet ﷺ in this. We can stay patient. We can ask upon God to help us and give us strength to bear our trials. Because that's what the Prophet ﷺ did. And that's how you can succeed. So, moving on. Now we're getting on to some things that happened before revelation. So just briefly, the three main points you want to remember here are the Prophet ﷺ was free from any blemish. So like we talked about during his early years, he was protected from any sins. There's a story, another interesting story about how the Prophet ﷺ, one time he heard music and there was some sort of party going on. And so he was a bit curious and he wanted to go and check it out and see what's going on. And as he was going, he felt unconscious. So basically he wasn't even able to get to that party. He just fell unconscious. So even that curiosity, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protected him from even getting close to anything that could possibly tarnish his reputation. So he was completely free from any blemish. And you can remember that through the story of the falling unconscious when he heard music. Another thing is that at this time, he started to have a lot of true dreams. So we'll get into this in a little bit, but he often had true dreams, and he would literally see them play out in his life just as he dreamt of them. And finally, we can learn about the isolation and the meditation of the Prophet ﷺ during this time. So as he was gearing up for revelation, he started to spend a lot of time in the cave and a lot of time away from society just to meditate and just to isolate and contemplate, basically. So, like I mentioned before, the Prophet ﷺ began to see dreams, and everything he would see would be extremely clear, so he could remember everything that he saw. And just something to know about this is that if a prophet sees a dream, it's revelation. So whenever a prophet sees a dream, it's a true revelation from God. Another thing is that dreams are a part of prophethood. So it's mentioned that they're 1/26 of prophethood. And finally, the Prophet ﷺ said that pious dreams, so good dreams, they're there to give you good news. So if you have a good dream, if you know that it's a pious dream, then it's there for you. It's good news for you. And there's different types of dreams. So we can all have dreams, and I believe there's two main categories. There's dreams, or three main categories. There's dreams from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So normal people can have these dreams. And the Prophet ﷺ said that truthful dreams are seen by those who are most honest. And then there's also dreams from shaitan, which are bad dreams. And we mentioned before this person named Khalid ibn Walid. So, radiallahu anhu, sometimes he would have nightmares. And the Prophet ﷺ told him, whenever you have a nightmare, whenever you have a bad dream, you should recite a dua, like A'udhu Billah, and then you can go back to sleep. And you can also recite Surah Nas and Surah Falaq to protect you from these bad dreams. So these bad dreams do happen. Sometimes they're from shaitan. Moving on. So 3 years before revelation, the Prophet ﷺ became more inclined to go to Cave Hira and just meditate and reflect. And he would go into self-isolation and just, think about life, think about things. He wanted to be away from that society because, at this time, the society, they're still worshipping idols. So he wanted to stay away from that. And sometimes he would stay in the cave for days, for weeks, and just meditate. One thing about this is that most, if not all prophets, had some sort of isolation to gain Allah's closeness. So all the prophets had some sort of isolation in their lives, had some sort of meditation, some time away from people to focus on Allah. So if we think about this, how much time do we spend just, being away from society, being away from the people, being away from our phones even, and just thinking about life, just thinking about the world we're in, and thinking about our Creator. That's what the prophets used to do over and over again, oftentimes, to develop this closeness with their Creator. And that's one thing that I think it's important for us to do as well, because we always have our phones with us. We're always distracted with something. Something is always going on in our life, but we don't spend a lot of time thinking about what's going to happen in the next life and why we're really here and how amazing this world that we see around us truly is. So I think it's important for us to at least, spend a few minutes just thinking about that. Just be away from everything and just think. And this inevitably gives you a bit of closeness. And it's the practice of all the prophets, especially the Prophet ﷺ, especially him. So while he was in the cave, his wife Khadija, radiallahu anha, she would bring him food just to keep him going. And another thing we can learn about this is if the Prophet ﷺ wasn't busy serving people, like we mentioned, he was a tradesman, he was a shepherd, he would serve people. He was busy trying to connect with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He was busy trying to connect with his Creator, with his purpose in life. So he had these two kind of phases of life, you could say, helping people and connecting with God. All right. And so the last thing that we'll mention today we mentioned about these signs of prophethood. So we mentioned that he had true dreams, that he became inclined to go and isolate and meditate. And he also mentioned, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that during this time he could hear rocks, he could hear trees, he could hear the mountains actually saying salam to him. So as he's walking around in nature, things are talking to him and saying salam, like saying peace to him. And that was just another sign that, things are not normal. There's something special going on over here. So all of this was happening before revelation. And obviously we know of the first revelation. Many of us know this event. The Prophet ﷺ was in cave Hira and he was meditating one night, and all of a sudden Angel Jibreel comes and he tells him to read Iqra, the first revelation, right? And we'll talk about this in the next lesson, inshallah. But just to give you guys a brief, introduction to it. When Angel Jibreel came down, he basically squeezed the Prophet ﷺ 3 times. And the first time he squeezed him, he said, read, Iqra. And think about this, right? You're just alone. Nobody's around you. You can't even hear people coming. And all of a sudden, this random, I don't even know, angel comes down and tells you to read. That's really frightening, first of all. But also kind of interesting. And so Angel Jibreel came and squeezed him really, really hard. And he did this 3 times. And then finally, he gave the revelation of Iqra, which is the first 5 verses of Surah Al-Alaq. And that was the first revelation. And what happened was the Prophet ﷺ was so frightened by this event, he went back running, and he came back to his wife, Khadija radiallahu anha, and he said, cover me, because he was like shivering from the fright. And he was so scared that something bad would happen to him. And this is when Khadija radiallahu anha knows that the Prophet ﷺ finally revealed revelation. He's finally become a prophet. Because earlier we mentioned, Khadija knew from her uncle Waraqah that the Prophet ﷺ had some special signs about him. Remember, we also mentioned she saw angels guarding the Prophet ﷺ as he was coming back from the caravan, if you guys remember that. So she knew something special was happening, and she reassured the Prophet ﷺ. She said, listen, Allah would not do something bad to you. You take care of the needy. You take care of the oppressed. You keep your family ties. You help people. Your character is magnificent. Allah would not do something bad with you. That's the standing of our Prophet ﷺ, and that's where we'll leave off today. One thing that I think we can all take away from this is, one, just how special the life of the Prophet ﷺ was, and all these beautiful characteristics we can try to inculcate in our lives. We can try to be like him. We can try to have this care for the people that are around us. We can try to have this discipline, this perseverance to try and succeed in this life like the Prophet ﷺ did, and to try and practice Islam to the best of our ability. And the last thing is that as all these things are happening, we can also understand that now we have to prepare for a lot of trial, a lot of difficulty that the Prophet ﷺ will face. So that's what we'll end off today. We'll leave 5 minutes or so for questions. So if you guys have any questions, please feel free to raise your hand and just shout out whatever you guys want. All right? Cool.
Hassan, go ahead.
I have a question. It's not really like one story or anything, but I was wondering if Surah Alaq, right? It was the first 5 ayahs were mentioned. That was like the first revelation. Like, why isn't that the first the last surah?
Oh, so you're talking about the ordering of the surahs, right? Yeah. So, I'm not sure exactly why. What I do know is that the Prophet ﷺ, when the Quran was being revealed, he had some companions that were compiling, the order of the surahs. They were writing down the surahs as well, and he ordered them to place it in this order. So that's according to the wisdom of the Prophet ﷺ. I'm not exactly sure what the reason of that is for, but all that I know is that one thing that we can kind of think is maybe the Prophet ﷺ was thinking about the people that will come after. So obviously we're not with him, and we don't know the chronological order of the ayat that are being revealed. So we know some. We know that Iqra was first. We know that there is a ayah in Surah Ma'idah which talks about the completing of the religion. That was one of the last ayat. But we don't know everything in chronological order. So the Prophet ﷺ, perhaps he put it in this order in the Quran, so that as an ummah, as we're reading this, we can kind of make sense of the Quran in our context. So as Muslims trying to learn our deen, that's perhaps a reason why it was done like that. But we know that it's not arbitrary. So the reason why the surahs are in the Quran like this, there is a specific reason for it. The Prophet ﷺ did it out of his wisdom. Any other questions? Cool. All right. So I guess we can end for today. If you guys think of questions, feel free to tell brother Salim. You guys can text me if you have my number. And inshallah we can try to answer these questions for you. Yeah, inshallah. Okay, so we'll end off here. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you guys.
Alaikum assalam, Faraz. Jazakallah khair.